she will let me know when we start. We actually have a little bit more time than 1 hour. I'm going to try to keep it to an hour, as we've all been over webinared
Yes.
and over Zoom.
Yes.
But just to let you know, I mean, in case all of a sudden there's a fantastic debate or discussion going on with some of the questions, we could.
Yeah, I have to leave at 4 o'clock because there's another webinar.
Absolutely.
So I'll be, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, but thank you, everybody, participants from around the globe, to choose to come and join our webinar. As you know, you probably all have 3 other ones that you could be taking part in at this very moment, but we'll try to make sure you don't regret your choice, because we have a distinguished panel of experts around the table. We have Yves Remy from Barbados. We have Stephen Karingi based in Addis. We have Faizel Ismael based in South Africa, and Junior Lodge is with us here in Brussels in Belgium. And so before I start opening the floor to the panel, I would like to give 2 quick logistical informations, or tell you 2 quick things. So this is a Zoom session of about 1 hour, and all of you are following it via YouTube. And so please, if you have questions, put those in the YouTube chat, and they will be forwarded to us by Matteo and Martina. Thank you for that. But so in principle, we will have a 1 hour debate. Each of the speakers will talk for about 7 minutes, and then I will have probably still a question for them to talk amongst each other. And then I hope to be able to allow as many questions as possible. So please, while the participants are talking, or while the panelists are talking, don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat, the YouTube chat. And secondly, I have to say this discussion is actually part of a larger research project that is being coordinated under the competent leadership of Bernard Hoekman from EUI. And it is supported by Horizon 2020. And this is called RESPECT, meaning realizing Europe's soft power in economic cooperation and trade. And so here in this session, actually, we're not starting from the European perspective, but rather from the perspective of Africa and the Caribbean, and trying to see how COVID has impacted these regions and the continent, and actually is impacting their trade strategy, and only then going to look at, so what do they think of the European trade strategy, or how does it link? What are you expecting from Europe in this context? So without further ado, and in order to allow for as rich a debate as possible, I would like to invite Stephen from, who's the Director of Regional Integration and Trade Division at UNECA, to give us his point of view in terms of how you see that this pandemic is actually affecting global trade, and what lessons you draw from this in general, but obviously also for Africa as a continent, and where you see the role of Europe in this perspective. Stephen?
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, from wherever you are participating in this webinar. So first of all, I would want to start by saying that COVID-19, of course, has been catastrophic globally. And if it has been catastrophic globally, it is actually even more so for developing countries, including those in Africa. We can look at examples, first of all, of what we saw happening in Europe when we had these multiple export restrictions, when countries were fighting for COVID supplies and medical supplies. And we read in the press a lot of things that were happening. So for countries and regions like Africa, where there's so much dependence on the export of primary commodities and also the importation of manufactured products. I cannot think of a better representation of what one would call a perfect storm, in the sense that we saw the drying up of supplies of life-saving equipment, not to speak the increase in the prices in the market on the one hand, but also we also saw the plummeting of prices of the major exports in which Africa deals with. It's no wonder then, given this short background, that African countries, like many other countries, have started to question, or they found themselves questioning their long-held confidence in the global trading system as a source of market stability and also rules-based engagement with the rest of the world. In fact, the legal and institutional manifestation of international solidarity and humanity was actually tested a lot when countries were trying to, at the height of dealing with the pandemic in Europe. Now, almost inevitably, it's right to say that the African countries have started wondering whether they were doing the right thing to have relied so much on the global trading system in the first place, as a system, because it's a system they have always perceived as skewed towards the interests of the powerful from the very early days. So like most other countries in other parts of the world, African governments have started to relearn, or at least they are starting to relearn the old lessons about self-reliance, self-sufficiency, back to the everyone for itself philosophy of the yesteryears. And I think we have seen this as many countries, and we can give specific examples of how countries, including here in Africa, are actually repurposing their manufacturing lines because they felt themselves in this situation whereby they are not able to access the kind of supplies they need to be able to deal with the pandemic. But the most interesting thing here, and I think Faizel will be talking a little bit more on this, is that in the case of Africa, the self is not the small, it's not the individual national boundaries of individual African countries. When Africa started looking, asking the question, have we been doing the right thing? They consider themselves in terms of the 54 most small economies to define the self. And they realize that it's within this continent made up of 1.2 billion people that could actually help us deal with the challenges that they are facing under the COVID-19. And this is where the AFCFTA comes in handy. COVID-19 has basically put a spotlight on the AFCFTA itself, that the AFCFTA cannot just be a trade agreement alone, and I think I'll come back to this issue later. It must also be a development agreement as well. And I think this is something that from the beginning, Africa saw that the AFCFTA is not just an instrument for bringing down the trade barriers, but must also be an instrument that is also used to ensure that there are quantifiable manufactured goods that are produced within the continent and traded within the continent. This is why those of you who have followed the AFCFTA would know that the AFCFTA is not just about trade, but it's also about industrialization. It's also about ensuring that governments build infrastructure for integration. And also, it's also an instrument which can only be achieved if there is a closer interaction of the African people as they move across the borders. So, but I would want to say that Africa is also clear that the AFCFTA cannot be a substitute of the global trading system. So even though there has been skepticism, there has always been some skepticism, and this question has also arisen again because of what the pandemic has spotlighted in terms of the question of saving lives and what is happening to the African economies because of the breakdown of the supply chains. Africa also realizes that AFCFTA cannot be a substitute for the global trading system. and this is where the question of the trade policy that you're asking, Africa has always been clear that the rules-based multilateral trading system was found wanting in the first instance. However, Africa has also been very clear that all COVID-19 has done is to prove the need for a stronger and a more operationally effective WTO rather than the absence of it. In fact, if the WTO, or at least the multilateral trading arrangement that controls the rules of doing trade was not there, what COVID-19 has done is actually to convince us why we would have had to create it now if it never existed. So what we need to do is to fix what we have now, make it fit for challenges such as what we are facing, and also make it useful at a time when trade is not just about wealth, which is what everyone has always thought about, but also about life and death, as COVID-19 has demonstrated. So Africa's belief here can be seen in the way it is pursuing its own integration agenda. And I think I will jump this and let Faizel talk a little bit more about this. But to say that when it comes to the question of what Europe can do as it thinks about the big agenda of respect that you have highlighted, I think there's a lot that Europe can do in terms of working with Africa. Because first of all, again, I've said the AFCFTA is not enough. It is both a trade and a development tool, but it cannot supplant the global trading rules. We need to have a multilateral trading system that works. And so even as Europe thinks about its trade policy, what are some of the things that I think Europe should do? Three things that I would want to highlight here. The first thing is that Europe needs to have principled leadership at the global level to safeguard multilateralism and ensure that it is restored back to its rightful place. So we should not be able to see the kind of indiscipline at the multilateral level that we have seen over the last 6 months when the world was trying to deal with the pandemic. Now, the second thing I would want to say here is that Europe should also be there to support Africa's homegrown integration agenda through the AFCFTA. And Europe should ensure that it is not in any way undermining this agenda, or at least the AFCFTA, or rather the integration agenda through the AFCFTA, should not be undermined by EU's own external trade, development, and foreign policy choices, which often sometimes, as we have seen, lack internal coherence themselves. And lastly, Europe should use its capability to leverage its global role to help Africa realize its industrialization agenda. So I can come back to some of these points in the context of the respect broader agenda, but I think those are three things that at least Europe can do, even as it works with Africa, in the rethinking and in advancing the role of trade in development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I like the self was actually the continental, the reaction of Africa. I very much like that. Thank you also for being quite concrete on the suggestions of what you think Europe should be doing. Without further ado, let me indeed ask Faizel Ismael, who's the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, to give the perspective from indeed the African continent and how you see this pandemic. Is it actually a trigger to fast track the CFTA, or is this going to maybe reduce even the willingness to go forward? And we're all ears. Thank you, Faizel.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I would like to maybe start by supporting the points that Stephen made before me. He set the context for the discussion. I think I've been asked to talk about trade, development, and Africa, and what the European Union can do. And I'd like to start by answering the question you just posed. We hosted a webinar a few weeks ago here at the Mandela School, and we had as one of the guest speakers, the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, Wamkele Mene, and he was quite clear, and he echoed the sentiment, I think, in the room, that trade is even more important today than it was before the pandemic. Of course, for leaders on the continent, the health issues are the priority today. And so the implementation of the AFCFTA has been delayed by a few months, but the importance of trade has never been more felt on the continent. It's important as we start this topic to say a few words about ideas and about trade and the relationship between trade and development. And then I'll say a few things about how I think Africa should engage in trade and the AFCFTA, and what Europe can do to support Africa, because that's the question. So the first point is that, even before the pandemic, there was a crisis on trade around the world. The United States, of course, has been vociferous, and even in many European countries, there has been a pushback on trade. Of course, developing countries have been making their concerns felt for many years, because in many cases, mainstream economists associate trade with development. And it's important for us to understand that trade is not equal to development. Trade is a very important tool for development, but it needs to be complemented by other very important policies, which I'll talk about in a minute. In Africa, we have understood the importance of regional trade or regional integration, just like Europe did at the turn of after the Second World War, when Europe went on to create its own economic integration process. For Europeans, the imperative of trade was crucial for their own economic development. They need to cooperate, and they built the foundations of their integration project on the principle of solidarity. And here too in Africa, we are building the African Continental Free Trade Agreement on this principle of solidarity or Ubuntu. And that means we've got to understand that trade on its own will not succeed in sharing the benefits for all the countries on the continent. Some countries may lose and some may gain unfairly. And therefore, it is important to understand that we need a broader concept of what I call developmental regionalism. And what that means, there are four things which that means. The first is that trade has to be fair. And by fair trade, we mean that the smaller countries' interests must be prioritized, because we know from history that those that are more well endowed, that are more competitive, will be the main winners if we simply open the market. And therefore, we need the trade agreements, the way the agreements are implemented, to be fair and asymmetrical in timing and in content. And that means that we've got to make sure that the way in which trade arrangements are secured takes into account the differences between the larger and the smaller countries. Now, the European Union decided in the year 2000 to change its relationship with Africa from a preferential arrangement to a reciprocal arrangement. It did so, in my view, prematurely. It was also the same date, the year 2000, when the United States, led by President Clinton, started the African Growth and Opportunity Act. In my life, I negotiated both agreements. One, a South Africa-EU free trade agreement, and the South Africa-US African Growth and Opportunity Act. And the African Growth and Opportunity Act is a arrangement has been extended to 2025. The EU should learn from that experience. The EAs implemented have not worked well in Africa. It will create anxiety about the implementation of the EPA. So I would suggest to review the implementation of EAs in the context of the AFCA, the alignment of these negotiations.
Uh-oh, we lost Faizel. I think, I mean, shall we give him 1 minute to get back? If not, yeah, maybe I would suggest, Yves, if you can come back, and then we would let him make his, the rest of the comments after you and Junior have spoken. If I may, then Yves, Remy, you're Deputy Director at the Shridath Ramphal Center for Trade Law and Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies. And may I ask you to give the Ghanaian perspective on this pandemic and the impact indeed, and how your region is seeing trade policy in this broader context and the role for Europe. Thank you, Yves. Oh, you have your mic on mute. Okay.
Ah, there we are. Sorry, we're back.
Okay, Faizel. Yeah, okay. Yves, do you agree? We will let Faizel, but maybe Faizel, can you already go and you have, can I give you only 3 more minutes if that's okay? I was just letting Yves talk, but maybe it's better if you can finish and then we will let Yves continue. Okay.
That's fine. So what I was saying is that the way in which the CFTA has been working, has been implemented, requires the EPAs to be realigned so that they are consistent with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And Europe should take a pause and reflect on the current arrangements that it is negotiating with different African countries so that its approach is consistent. I would like to support the views that Stephen made about the need for trade to be complemented with efforts to build the industrial capacity of countries on the continent. Africa's relationship with Europe is still characterized as one of a primary goods producer and a primary goods exporter. We still export coffee and tea, cocoa, and other products unprocessed. And we do require more effort to be put into processing these goods at home and building regional value chains on the continent. So I would say that's the second issue. The third is to ensure that we support the build cross-border infrastructure projects on the continent. It's ironical that the Chinese are now the larger player on the African continent, whereas Europe has such a deep and long history with Africa and has much more responsibility to provide the necessary finance. And finally, I would say that for trade to succeed, it must be complemented as well with democratic governance. African countries are making progress. The African peer review mechanism has more than 30 members on the continent. African countries are reviewing each other. They're making progress every day. And Europe needs to support the efforts of African countries in this regard. There are many things that Europe too can do to support governance at the national and intercontinental level, starting with issues related to illicit finance and profit shifting, and ensuring that more than $50 billion a year that moves from Africa to Europe begins to flow back to the continent where it belongs. Europe could do a lot more to stabilize remittances through migration, through better policies on migration, so that Africa could benefit from its people working abroad. And Europe could do a lot more in the multilateral trading system to strengthen the WTO so that it is fairer and it works in the interests of developing countries as well. And so the reform process now that's taking place in the WTO requires the active intervention of the European Union so that we don't follow those countries that are trying to undermine the workings of multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faizel, and indeed thank you for your very concrete agenda for Europe. I hope some of the European policymakers are indeed listening, and if not, we will make sure some of these messages also get to them. But and certainly in the context of the work, the respect work, your link to democratic governance and what EU can do sounds interesting, and we can continue in the further discussion of whether that should be integrated within the trade policy and trade agreements or actually should be complementary, but that's for the next discussion. Without further ado, can I then indeed invite you, Yves, to bring our Caribbean perspective on the issue?
Good morning from this part of the world, Barbados anyway. Let me thank you, Kathleen, and the organizers for an opportunity to share with you some modest perspectives of what I think can only be the start and very broad strokes in 8 minutes of an unfolding discourse on COVID's impact on the Caribbean's trade and development trajectory and priorities. So I'm going to present my thoughts in two main parts. The first focuses on the lessons that we have learned or relearned through the lives and the livelihoods prism. And then the second will turn more concretely to the EU CARIFORUM trading relationship that I was asked to address, to see what the immediate and enduring solutions might reside there in that relationship. So of the lives narrative, COVID jolted our Caribbean governments into immediate containment and emergency mode that our disaster preparedness for hurricanes and previous health scares have equipped us well for. Through strong and decisive leadership, to date, we have been able to contain the virus. Our morbidity and mortality rates remain extremely low, even when compared with our EU counterparts, as the BBC reporting has chronicled. Unfortunately, that is where the positive comparison ends for us. The livelihood story is one of projected economic catastrophe for our region. Without the liquidity recovery packages Europe can execute, our leaders' options lie in asking for a sympathetic air from the international community, to our plaintive cries that vulnerabilities that we have to economic, social, climatic, and now health shocks, irrespective of our GDP per capita, puts us in a special class of nations requiring specific attention. And the case for specific treatment is compelling. COVID meant a shutdown in air and cruise travel, translating to zero income in our coffers, being a region that is almost 50% dependent on tourism. It has led to stress in supply chains, a downturn in commodities, where we have a country that has recently discovered oil deposits, a contraction in FDI and remittances, added to chronic indebtedness, with debt ratios averaging 68% of GDP. So the response of CARICOM as a grouping was understandably to have a flurry of meetings of every C, body acronym across CARICOM. CARFA for health, CARDI for agriculture, SEDIMA for disasters, CRE for renewable energy, CTO for tourism. That at least showed signs of a regional project that has some offshoots or some shoots. But I think COVID also ingrained in our collective regional consciousness a few sobering realities about both the possibilities and limitations of our regional integration project. And the first is the extent of our food insecurity in the region. We have an import bill of over $5 billion US, and we source 90% of our food extra-regionally. That is a staggering statistic. Border closures meant that the market for our produce out as well as imports in were stymied. And our first impulse was to start to look inward, ranging from home gardening. We saw videos of our prime ministers in their back gardens, to more concrete regional plans of taking our regional agricultural plants off of the shelves, to developing more planting at a regional basis, planting of drought and climate resistant crops, promoting agro-processing, and creating more robust regional food chains. Now, while these are positive steps, the trenchant issues of regional transport, expensive systems, and protectionist SPS standards also cry out for attention. Second, and I've heard this from my African panelists, like the rest of the world, our dependence on critical medical supplies was laid bare. Although it prompted some countries to remove tariffs and others to direct manufacturing for higher value activity to the production of sanitizers and toilet paper, and even innovation by some of our students of the University of the West Indies to create ventilators. I think the deeper question was, how do we manage these critical supply shortages on a more collective basis through, for instance, collective procurement of these internationally required medical supplies, especially in times of shortages. I'm hopeful that the crisis has also shot a new injection into the need for free movement of persons to form the basis for our CARICOM regional integration project. We opened our doors with ease to our Cuban medical aid assistance, which hopefully should be instructive in our CARICOM project. We've also seen deployment of very unique individual coping strategies. Jamaica, for instance, has bolted out of the block, no pun and bolted, defining a national export-led strategy that seeks to look more inward to internal sources of private sector funding and diasporic engagement. And I think across all of the countries in the Caribbean, we've been seeing national digital strategies for SMEs and government transformation underway. Hopefully these efforts will not come at the expense of the broader regional project. So turning outward now on CARICOM's relationship with the EU through the EPA, which remains the only structured reciprocal relationship we have in trade outside of the WTO. In a sense, that relation assumes elemental significance for our international trade policy. And I see two concrete ways that the EPA can provide a secure basis for cooperation in this and future pandemics. First of all, Europe has to be our reliable partner. Besides China, our sourcing of medical supplies comes from the European Union. So one idea is for us to create some kind of side agreement on medical supplies and pharmaceuticals that we can witness the EU has signed with other FTA partners. And that side agreement would require the region to be exempted from the export prohibitions and restrictions that we saw during the start of the COVID pandemic, and an exemption for our region, as Europe provided for other regions, as we saw in their notification to the EU. We would want a guarantee of sources, a guaranteed source of supplies for testing kits, vaccinations when they are created, that we cannot source regionally. Our small size means that we are unlikely to be first in line when the vaccine comes out and unable to negotiate and command high prices. So our people will have to wait at the back of the line. That agreement could also create a harmonized system of standardization and conformity of medical supplies, and also intellectual property rights between our regions, so that these assessments do not serve as impediments to trade in medical supplies between our regions. And I'd also like to see a commitment to research and innovation programs, like those funded under the Horizon 2020, to help in clinical trials and find joint solutions between our medical labs and our universities, as I have seen, for instance, happen with Africa. The second area that we could focus on is tourism. Under the Article 118 of the EPA, there's a dialogue mechanism for tourism. Let's use that to discuss mutual recognition of health certification and testing, allocation of responsibilities as we open up, agreement for common standards for hotels, prioritizing insurance packages, so that we send the necessary signals to European travelers that we are ready to safely offer tourism services. In its recovery packages, Europe could privilege airlines with transatlantic flights to our islands. But the EPA can also form the background for the resetting of trade relations. The cultural protocol that we have should inspire new thinking of how to target the European consumer to provide e-concert services from our producers, our entertainers. But more fundamentally than the specifics, I want the COVID to usher in a more meaningful relationship between the Caribbean and the EU. No doubt we can learn from Europe about how integration can work through a charity begins at home mentality, privileging regional relationships over others, especially in times of crisis. But Europe must also stand with the Caribbean and be an agent for good for us. Our relationship has to be prioritized and clearly defined in ways that we are seeing their relationship defined in other regions like Africa. I must admit it is disheartening to see that at a time when we are most beleaguered, we have been blacklisted. And that is a very murky subject, but there are dialogue and other provisions provided under the EPA where we can engage in constructive discussion on this topic. At a broader level of advocacy at the WTO and elsewhere, Europe should not just assist, but understand and help propagate the message of GDP per capita not being the fair metric by which to judge the Caribbean's capacity to deal with international crises like COVID and eventually climate change. And we may want to see a more harmonized approach to trade negotiations across the different negotiating phases. For the EU to approach us in a spirit of compromise and willingness in the WTO, where we could jointly require or advocate for reforms in the context of current WTO dispute settlement. Finally, can I just say that the EU relationship must serve as a conduit for not just deepening, but triangulating relationships with our friends in Africa and the Pacific, not just in the post-Cotonou negotiations context, but also as a basis for joint and collaborative programs such as this one and others at the academic and civil society levels. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Yves, for this passionate plea indeed for Europe to stand with you, but for also lots of concrete ideas and the good insights. And I think it follows immediately on to what Junior Lodge, who's a trade expert, international trade expert here in Brussels, and advisor also to the Caribbean on post-Cotonou. We've asked you actually to bring, as you're based in Brussels and you have your finger on the pulse also in this European policymaking context, whether you can bring your perspective indeed of what Europe can do for both Africa and the Caribbean in this post-COVID trade globalized world. Thanks, Junior. The floor is yours. You're muted. You're still muted, Junior. Junior? Ah, okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity also to listen and learn. One additional word of introduction, which is that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. So nothing that I say here should be attributed to the CARIFORUM group for whom I work. I think it's important to state that Europe has indeed offered some assistance to developing countries. They have released almost 21 billion euros in direct support, and that should obviously be welcomed. But we have to see this problematic in two ways. One is obviously to cauterize the wound of this economic destruction, this economic tsunami called COVID-19 in terms of the impact, and a number of other panelists have indeed registered that, but also see what kind of opportunities could be presented by this crisis in terms of moving forward and developing some kind of long-term solution. So I want to focus on the latter, given that there's indeed a strong convergence, certainly in terms of my view, with what I've heard from previous panelists. I just want to make three quick points in terms of what possible contribution Europe could make to the Caribbean. And indeed, I think these are also relevant to Africa, if I may. One is to help these regions reimagine their own sustainable development. It is clear that there is a kind of agenda that is emerging with respect to pushing the shift towards renewable energy production and distribution. Developing a blue economy, especially in the context of a Caribbean, which is indeed rich with resources. Increasing backward linkages between tourism and agriculture. We heard Yves mention the food import bill, and part of that is indeed triggered by the fact that we have a relatively successful tourism industry, but which has a high propensity of importing agricultural food as opposed to using domestic production. Yves also mentioned connectivity. This has been a long-standing issue ever since the modern history of the Caribbean. We are indeed geographically discontiguous, and therefore this problem of connectivity, and in particular of the movement of people, has been problematic. So it's an opportunity to address that. And the final element in terms of, let's say, a cluster of initial interventions would be in terms of investing in skills development, so that we have a labor force which is fit and ready. And here, one has to commend the European Union. They have already given us some kind of an approach which might be worth replicating, worth reviewing, and possibly also for you, Kathleen and Bernard, as academics to study, which is the Africa-Europe Alliance for Investment and Jobs, and see to what extent that has been successful. But certainly from its conceptualization, it is something that I think is worth replicating for the Caribbean. However, in that reimagining of Caribbean sustainable development, while there is indeed a role for the CSME, we should recognize that that process has been rather anemic for a host of different reasons, and it is unlikely to be accelerated in the immediate period. And therefore, we need to look at novel forms of regional integration. In fact, perhaps we should accentuate regional cooperation as a way of engendering confidence among the countries to deliver concrete outputs that could then foster greater ambition later. And in that regard, ASEAN has long been a symbol of an alternative type of regional integration, not the yet administrative institutionalized process that we have grown accustomed to in Europe, but more recently the Pacific Alliance has, in my view, become a very attractive approach where it is focusing on concrete deliverables around effective cooperation. So that's one, reimagining Caribbean sustainable development. The second is trying to make trade work better for developing countries. We have heard and we know of the instances of trade injustices, and unfortunately these tend to be afflicting LDCs, and in particular African LDCs. We know of cotton and the long-standing problem, and how Europe has reacted has been noble to a certain extent, which is basically to say, look, our subsidies, domestic support, are not as contentious, they are not voluminous. However, we know that China and the United States continue to be heavy users of domestic support. So this is where it is not enough for Europe just to reform its own agenda, but to act as a global ambassador, as a global player for development, to leverage engagement among China, United States, and the C4 to rectify this problem. More recently, we have seen the case of teff, and in particular, where a Dutch researcher patented teff. Now recall, teff is a 2,000-year grain, Ethiopian grain, and someone in Holland decided that this is my intellectual property. Now, of course, we understand that Ethiopia is in the throes of its WTO accession, and therefore its own intellectual property regime is not yet fully determined. However, again, this is an area where we believe that Europe could exercise some leadership in terms of political and technical support to safeguard the interest of Ethiopian farmers, and at the same time to promote the accession of Ethiopia in the WTO. Another quick area in terms of possible support, and in a way a kind of quick hit, is in terms of public procurement. Public procurement represents 14% of European GDP. This is a 2 trillion euro industry that is administered each year. Why not open up the European public procurement market to African and Caribbean countries? If we were to get even 1% of that, that's already a significant sum. And by the way, 2 trillion just happens to be equivalent to the continental GDP of Africa. So it is rather significant. And not just open it up, of course, but simply try and give African and Caribbean SMEs the tools to contest that market. Another area is in terms of making sure that we replicate the TFA. I am deeply saddened by the fact that the ACP and the European Union are the 2 midwives of the trade facilitation agreement, and in particular the approach of forging a new architecture for special and differential treatment, where we make the assumption of new commitments contingent on the delivery of trade support. And yet in Geneva, the European Union seemed to have resiled from that approach. This is an approach which could be relevant, especially in terms of some of the areas that are under discussion, not only within the WTO, admittedly a rather limited agenda, but also with respect to bilateral trade agreements. So again, it is in terms of Europe exercising political leadership. The final element in terms of making trade better is a pet interest of mine, which is in terms of forging global skills partnership. This is the WHO initiative, which is primarily aimed at mitigating the negative impact of brain drain. Now, in particular in the Caribbean and possibly in Africa, we have a comparative advantage in the training of nurses. That's why Europe and other industrialized countries, they poach our nurses and other health professionals, because they are far cheaper to be trained in these countries as opposed to Europe. The WHO has recognized that there is a 1.8 million skills gap within Europe in terms of health professionals, 500,000 of which are nurses. Why not let's have a global skills partnership for Caribbean nurses to be trained in the Caribbean, expand the training facilities that we have there, where we can then attract the enrollment of European nationals. They come, they stay, they frequently pay market-based tuition fees, so that triggers independent streams of funding for these tertiary institutions. And of course, friends and families are visiting these students. They are staying in either hotels or other forms of accommodation, eating jerk chicken, eating Caribbean figs, otherwise known as green bananas, etc. But more importantly, and just as important, they're also going back as ambassadors, because that's what direct interaction and staying in a country over an extended period of time can engender. So, and this is just a public, this is just a public good, a global public good, which is already in the domain. It is a WHO initiative. I'll end with one final thought, which is global leadership. And again, it is in terms of just connecting the dots. So we already have a development framework, a global development framework. It's called the SDGs. So why not let's advance with its implementation? Now, of course, here comes a big question, which is how do we fund it? And here, there's a recent communication from Europe, which actually mentioned a number of new sources of taxation. One was a carbon tax, another was an international financial transaction tax, and the third was a digital tax. So Europe is already thinking about these elements. Now, of course, we know it's a very, very contentious issue, taxation as such, but there's a study which suggested that in the US alone, if a 5% tax were imposed on the wealth of the 1% richest Americans, it would generate $2 trillion US dollars. Why not let's get a global approach where we can hypothecate the amount of taxes that are required to support SDGs, and Europe is not just solely reliant on its own resources to say, look what we're doing, but it is also marshalling the engagement of other countries. So I'll end there, but the key element in my view is in terms of making sure that we get a more robust, engaged, and results-oriented European Union to engage as a trade and development partner. And one final comment, which is not to repeat the mistake of 2008 financial crisis, where according to Simon Evany, the number of G20 measures that were imposed to try and mitigate the impact of that crisis resulted in LDCs losing 1/3 of their export receipts over a 4-year period. So in other words, there has to be some monitoring, systematic monitoring of the measures that are introduced, especially by industrialized countries, to make sure that there is no nefarious impact on small, poor, vulnerable economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junior, and thank all 4 of you. We don't have an awful lot of time for the discussion, but I think it was already very rich with a lot of rather concrete, specific ideas on what Europe can do. I heard a lot on, I think Faizel called it development regionalism. I think all 4 of you have spoken about the role of regionalism, maybe not in the institutional way we see it, but actually regional cooperation and fostering, finding ways to foster that and to ask for fair trade is definitely one of the things that has come back through all 4 of you. I don't know if any of you followed, but Bernard Hoekman had a conversation with Commissioner Hogan, the Commissioner of Trade, because Europe is doing a very public review also of its trade policy. And if maybe as a closing session, because all 4 of you are also asking for Europe to be taking up more its leadership role in the multilateral trading context, what is it you would want to say to Commissioner Hogan in terms of the role? How can Europe make the implementation of its external trade policy and its aid policy, how can it improve that? What would be your 1 minute answer. You all have 1 minute to respond. By the way, that's a question that came also from the floor. So I'm using that as a way to also wrap up, as I know Faizel has to leave sharply at 4. Maybe I'll give the floor first to you, Faizel.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a good question. As I said, in my earlier remarks, the first thing I would say to the Commissioner, have a relook at the EPAs. This negotiation has done real harm to the bilateral relationship between Europe and Africa. I speak from a country and a region which has done relatively better. I was the first negotiator, lead negotiator for South Africa with the European Union, and we negotiated the first trade agreement between any African country and the EU, a bilateral one. And now with the EPA, we have a relatively balanced trade agreement, a SADC EPA with the European Union. But the rest of the continent has very, very many complex challenges. And even in Southern Africa, the agreement we have signed has undermined regionalism because it's just with 5+1, 6 countries, and it has divided SADC, the Southern African Development Community. And the same has happened in every region on the continent. So let's renegotiate that. Second thing is, I hear that Europe is negotiating or discussing post-2020, what's going to replace the Cotonou agreement. But I don't know whether Europe is actually negotiating with Africa. So I'd like to say to her, please negotiate with the African Union about the post-2020 relationship. Because the first one, in the year 2000, when you launched the EPA process, you didn't consult Europe, you didn't consult Africa. So let's consult about the post-2020. The third thing I would say is please work in the WTO, give leadership, because the United States has decided to abandon the WTO. They've done that already by blocking appointments to the appellate body, and they are not playing a leadership role at all. So Europe needs to step in and work with other countries, especially developing countries, and Africa would be very willing to work with them to have a different approach to multilateralism, make it more inclusive and developmental. So those would be my suggestions. Thank you very much.
On the post-Cotonou one, I should say I can refer you to several other webinars. And if you want to have more insights, I think you should talk also to Junior. There's a lot of information out there. But yeah, that's a topic for a whole new discussion. But I hear you loud and clear, indeed, not undermining and taking leadership. Maybe Stephen, would you like to follow?
Thanks, that's fascinating conversation. So first, Africa's pathway to prosperity cannot be imagined without trade. So whatever conversations that take place should take account, or at least should recognize that unlike many other countries that had a huge pot of resources in being able to deal with the kind of shock that we have witnessed, Africa did not actually have those kinds of resources. And I think trade, and I believe trade, is one route towards prosperity. Now, having said that, we have listened carefully to some of the conversations that are taking place in Europe in the context of whether now you should introduce new elements in the trade policy moving forward. And I would like to say the following. In the building back from the current situation we have on rebuilding our economies post-COVID, it is important that trade be part and parcel of that pathway towards recovering of the economies. But we should not be sort of enticed to mix the issue of trade with issues that we know that trade policy or trade instruments cannot be able to deal with. So we agree that we need to rebuild better economies. We have the Paris Agreement that deals with the question of climate change. Our climate consciousness is actually it's already captured within the Paris Agreement, which we need to implement, but it would not be the right approach, for instance, to introduce clauses in trade conversations that are already captured in the Paris Agreement and that can be driven through that institutional mechanism. So that's the second important thing I would want to say. First, trade is important for Africa's prosperity. Let's not mix things as we rebuild. And finally, I want to emphasize Europe's leadership in bringing back confidence in global institutions is critical, because we cannot be able to rebuild a global economy that is fair without strong institutions. And Africa has suffered a lot because of global institutions that have not always taken account of the special needs of the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Very wise words, and absolutely on that's our real respect. Research is very much on your second point about not overloading the boat and using trade instruments for trade and other instruments that are there maybe for the non-trade objectives. Thank you. Junior, do you have a specific message for a closing message?
Thanks a lot. Just very quickly, there's some low-lying fruits. Obviously, in the WTO, there's the e-commerce agenda, fisheries subsidies. There's even environmental goods. Why not use the TFA model, especially in terms of treating with environmental goods? That would be a way of engendering deeper support among developing countries in particular, that the multilateral trading system is also working for them. So that's one, low-lying fruits. The second is in terms of just addressing in a more robust way trade injustices. I mentioned cotton before, but also in terms of accession. You might know that the Seychelles, and I think Faizel mentioned this in terms of the incoherence between regional integration and some of the multilateral commitments. The Seychelles, an economy which is 1.6 billion US dollars, has agreed to accede to the WTO agreement on government procurement. This came out, of course, out of their accession process, and that is driven in mainly by industrialized countries. I know that another great African tree servant, Singh, he worked when he was ACP coordinator on some minimum standards for market access in NAMA and agriculture for countries acceding. And perhaps we need the same kind of mechanism for all facets of accession, so that you don't get this incoherence of a small African country acceding, seeking to accede to the GPA when there's an African continental process which is not yet mature. So that's one. That's the second. The third is in terms of we have to be more consequential and robust about monitoring mechanism. The WTO, because it's a member-driven body, it is not exactly the best institution to deal with monitoring of its own members' trade measures. Of course, it has the TRM, and I've also seen some excellent work by a good friend of mine, Gaurav Santana, at the WTO Secretariat. But we need more monitoring of these measures, and that could serve then as a basis for concrete action. And again, this is where Europe could use its tremendous muscle to make that happen. And the final area, policy coherence. The Commission President, she repeats this mantra, do no harm. And it would be great if that were the precise modus operandi that used with respect to trade policy for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Trinu. We would hope more than do no harm, but indeed, let's be realistic. Yves, to close off.
Yeah, it's difficult to close off after these wonderful interventions and try to wrap it all up, but my interventions and closure will be short. I think what I'm hearing from all the panelists, and I can certainly endorse, is this idea that Europe has an opportunity, because of its past colonial ties, to represent and almost be a conscience for the world community in areas where it can advocate on behalf of those who are relatively voiceless in a number of these international fora. Of course, it behoves us nonetheless to do our part as well, but I think Europe has a responsibility in these fora to act in good conscience. And as I mentioned in my presentation, be the good conscience and stand with us on some of the things that we care about. And my fellow panelists have already elucidated what these are. I think if I can be partial for the Caribbean region, I think the vulnerability story is an important one. And you get the eyes rolling when it is said again and again, but we have very special and specific needs in the international community that other regions don't have. Africa, for all the deficiencies and shortages and shortcomings that they do have, they nonetheless are able to command attention because of the huge market and the commodities. And moving into manufacturing is a real viable option for them. They can feed themselves in some ways. The Caribbean is a different entity. The Caribbean is very vulnerable to a lot of these external shocks. And without somebody by our side propelling us and representing some of our interests, we actually are speaking into the void, and often without much support from countries that I think should understand our unique circumstance. The second point that I would want to make is the re-energizing of the EPA. I think the EPA was negotiated at a time when we in the Caribbean were even transitioning out of some of these legacy relationships, commodities, and some of these, older type of patterns that typified our trade with Europe and the rest of the world. And I think Junior makes some excellent suggestions of where the region's future lies. Its new regions, its new areas, areas where the region could benefit from the greater resources as well as the experience of some of our larger partners. And I think sort of re-energizing the EPA either through the post-Cotonou negotiations and taking up some of these themes, or using the EPA, as I suggested, as a base for furthering and deepening negotiations in real vital areas that are of concern and interest to the region proactively would be a good step. And finally, I think it behoves me not only to look to Europe for all the answers. I think Europe has its own asks of us, and I'd be very interested in having another forum where we reverse the question and ask them what they want from us. But let us not ignore this opportunity, gents from Africa, from my fellow ACP region, to also use the opportunity to begin the dialogue with each other. That is happening at the political levels. Maybe the critical mass we would have for huge engagement at the trade relations level doesn't exist yet, but I know our CARICOM leadership is speaking to African leadership about where the roots of that kind of trans-regional integration can take place. And so it would be nice to see us take that mantle forward and not wait for Europe and anyone else to do it, but to reach out across the ocean literally and begin speaking to each other about common experiences that we share based on our colonial history, but also our joint suggestions for trading and working with each other and collaborating in the future. So I would just like to end with that positive note, that the relationship with Europe doesn't need to alienate our relationships with each other, but should actually form the basis for strengthening them. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I see in the meantime, we have actually lost already Faizel. I know he had another commitment already at 4, but I found this absolutely a fascinating debate, and it has been recorded, so it will be actually also available for others to still continue watching it on EUI's YouTube channel. I think there were a lot of interesting ideas that came forward, and we will for sure, as ECDPM and as EUI and the consortium of that is working on these issues, continue and take a lot of that inspiration from all 4 of you, and take it forward, and hope to continue indeed in the dialogue with all of you. So thank you very much. Have a nice day. You still have to start, Jean-Yves. And to both of you, thank you very much also. And see you in the next, hopefully live rather than this virtual connection. But I was still very glad we could connect this way. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye.